Hello and welcome, it's James here, hope you're doing really well. So today I wanted to talk about Yamaha NS10s. What is the fuss all about? Now some people really like them, some people really hate them, but they have been around for a very long time and people are still mixing on them. So there must be something which is making people still come back to them and still find them and still buy them on the second-hand market. Now I am in the camp of the I love NS10s, and what I want to talk about in this video is kind of what I really like about them and just a little bit of an overview, and generally I want to tell you about why I think they are really good mixing tool. So let's dive right in. Okay, so we're going to start with a very brief history, and I mean brief because there's lots of information out there, and this is just to give you a bit of an overview. Okay, so they were designed by Akira Nakamura back in 1978, so a long time ago now. And they were originally meant for the hi-fi market, so they weren't even intended to be used in studios at the time. And actually, at the time, they didn't really do very well as hi-fi speakers. So jump forward a little bit, in the early 80s, that's when they started to take hold, and that's when they started to be seen and used around in recording studios. Now, one of the guys who was kind of well known for using the NS10s is Bob Clearmountain, the superstar mix engineer and music producer. And now lots of other people were also using them around the same time, but he was just one of the main people who started to essentially, become a bit of a pioneer of them. Now, it is said that at the time he was going from studio to studio and he wanted something which he could take from each studio to each studio, and they would offer continuity. They'd be like a consistent set of speakers that always sounded the same, so he kind of knew where he was at with them. It's also mentioned that he wanted something which just sounded horrible, and if you can make something sound good on something so horrible, then it's going to translate to everything else, and that was pretty much true. Now, of course, this is just one story. There are so many stories, but that's definitely one of them, and we're going to go with that one because it's a nice one. Now, he was also the first to put tissue paper over the tweeter, because at the time they were very harsh in the high end and they just weren't very pleasant to listen to, so that took the edge off. It is to be said that there's been many incarnations of the NS10, so that was the original version, but the subsequent versions like the the NS10M Studios, which is actually what I have, they've been tweaked. They tweaked the crossover, they adjusted or rather changed the tweeter, which meant that it's much less harsh to work on, and generally you didn't need the tissue paper with them. Now, it was basically from that point on when you just started to see them in all the studios, always just sitting on that meter bridge there, and they became something almost that you just expect to see in a studio. Now, a little bit in terms of the specs, they're made of, it's a wood cabinet, so about this big, not very big. I told you I'm not going to go too detailed. The tweeter is about 6 to 6.5 inches and it's a paper cone, and then you've got a little tweeter as well. Now, the frequency range of the speakers is actually like billed as 60 hertz to 20k, but they're quite small speakers, so actually that's not really what they're representing, because you've got a roll off at about 200 hertz, so that's when it really starts to fade away, and you've got a bump at about 2k as well, so that's really pushing the mid-range. Now, it is to be known that they are passive speakers, so you do need an amp to drive them. The earlier versions were, I think they took 50 watts, whereas the later versions like the NS10Ms is what I've got, they take up to 120 watts, so they can handle a little bit more power. Now, very quickly, what are the pros and cons? Now, the pros are they've got a very fast response time, so that means that you're getting a very accurate sound representation, which is really important. It's one of the big draws here. Now, the other really big draw, another really big pro, is the precise mid-range. Now, the mid-range is what this speaker is all about, which is what I'll get to in a second. Also, they're very low distortion and they generally translate very well. That's another really big plus about these. Now, the cons, one big con is that the high end can be quite harsh. Now, as mentioned, the original versions tended to do that a little bit more, whereas the later versions, not so much. So they're still fairly harsh and they're definitely quite aggressive in the mid-range, but nowhere near as much as the original versions were. They do lack low end, so there's not a lot of low end in them at all. And also the tweeters are kind of prone to blowing. Now, so far, touch wood, I haven't blown my tweeters, but you do need to be a little bit careful, and it's probably best to not really smash them, because then there's more chance of doing some damage. So just be careful. And now we get to the point which I think is the most important part. Why do we mix on them? As said before, they don't sound that great. They're not a beautiful speaker to listen to. They're quite harsh in the mid-range. They can be quite harsh in the high end as well, as mentioned. So why do you want to put yourself through that? Well, the main thing is the detail that it has in the mid-range is absolutely exceptional. If you imagine all the things that you have in your mix, you've got vocals, guitar, keys, snare, you've got the attack of the kick, you've got the bite of the bass. Pretty much everything sits in the mid-range. And also bear in mind how we hear is not proportionate. We hear the mid-range more than we do the high end and the low end. It's just what our ears are tuned into, and that's partly to do with how we speak. The main thing we listen to is speech, so our ears are tuned into speech. So it means that when you're mixing music, it's not a proportionate graph. So you're hearing much more mid-range. And now, because everything sits in the mid-range, you really need to get that as clear as you possibly can. And with these speakers, it is focusing the mid-range. It's basically showing you just the mid-range in like you're looking through a microscope. So when you're listening to all these things like just jammed into one place, you really need to work really hard with the mixing to make sure you can hear everything. So essentially, if you can nail the mid-range, then everything else kind of follows. And what's good about hearing this mid-range just so clearly is you don't get kind of sidetracked. You don't get overexcited by the boom and the tiz. You like that low end that you have in your bass guitar, in your kick drum, in your subs, whatever. You don't get kind of sidetracked by that, because if you can't hear all of these things, if you can't hear the detail of that in the mid-range, it's not going to translate to everything else. So bear in mind, when or rather when the general public is listening to your mixes, they don't usually listen on full range speakers. They're not always listening on a beautifully detailed full range system here and picking absolutely everything out in your mix. A lot of the time they're listening on phone speakers, laptop speakers, which is, just depressing when you spend hours trying to get something wonderful and they're not going to hear it all in its glory anyway. They're listening on small devices. They're listening in less than ideal conditions, essentially. But one thing that you can always hear in most of these devices, apart from maybe like some phone speakers and whatnot, is you're getting the mid-range. So nail that mid-range and the rest will follow. So what I do when I'm setting up a mix and when I'm going through a mix, this is kind of my process. Now, I've got NS10s, as mentioned, but I also have some nice pair of Genelecs, which are absolutely beautiful. They've got a really detailed mid-range as well. But what I'll generally do is I'll start with the NS10s. I'll get my mix going with the NS10s. This is at the point where everything is in, everything is cluttered to hell, and I'm trying to carve things out. I'm trying to carve out the space of individual instruments. Now, once that's in a good place and it's starting to sound reasonable and I'm kind of happy, I'm kind of thinking, yeah, this is sounding decent now. It's sounding balanced and in a good way. I can hear things. Then I'll go over to my Genelecs, and then you start to hear all the low end. You start to hear all the high end. You start to hear everything else that the Yamahas maybe didn't have. But what you are noticing is everything in the mid-range, in the majority of the sound, is there and it's clear. And then I spend a big chunk of the time just working on the Genelecs, getting everything in the right place, getting everything sounding wonderful, doing all I have to do to mix. And then at the end, let's say in the last, say the last 10%, I switch back to the NS10s, and that's when I'm really checking the balance. So I'm listening at low level, which I do in the Jennies as well, but I'd like to do it on the NS10s, and you can really hear if something is popping out. So if I've missed something on the other speakers, or I just want a second pair of ears, these are really, really good for checking the balance. And balance is also everything. Now, a couple of side notes. Does the amp matter? As said, earlier, these are passive monitors, so you do need an amp to drive them. I'd say the short answer is yes. Now, I'm not going to go into all the different amps because there are so many different amps that you can use, and there's lots of things out there on the internet. Just have a look at GearSpace, where everyone is talking about all the best amps that you can use with the NS10s. Now, these are going to vary in price. Okay, you can spend a lot of money on an amp, and you know, it really does make a difference. Now, from my personal experience, I've had two different amps for the same speakers. First, I had a Yamaha P3500, which is a great amp, and it was one which is also recommended, and they sounded great. They sounded very good. I mixed on them for quite some time. I want to say a couple of years, maybe more, and I really liked them. Now, I subsequently sold that amp, and I got a different amp. I got a Quad 306, which is a vintage amp, and they sounded totally different. I don't mean that they were, all of a sudden they had all the low end and they were just like magical and all of that. They're still in NS10s, but they sounded very different. The high end was much softer. It's still beautifully detailed, but it was just a little bit softer. It was less harsh on the ears, and it just had a warmer feel to it. And what I did find was that the amp, it drove them better, and it kind of felt like I could mix on them for longer without getting fatigued. Like, NS10s aren't too bad anyway, but the difference between these two amps was really quite great. So if you are looking at getting NS10s, I would recommend looking around, seeing what amps you can find, obviously within your budget, but just try and get the best one you can for your budget. And personally, I recommend a Quad 306, but there are fantastic ones which are even better, like the Bryston, for example. I think it's a 4D or something. Someone can correct me on that because more people know more than I do. So yeah, the amp really does make the difference. Okay, I've got a curveball for you. Do you need a sub? Now, some purists will say, no, I'm not going to use a sub with NS10s. That's not the point. It's meant to be focusing on a mid-range, and you shouldn't be hearing anything else. And I guess what I'm about to say is going to contradict all of what I've said previously, because yes, I do like a sub with NS10s. Sorry about that. Now, does that mean that they sound totally different? No, you're still getting all of the detail in the mid-range. You're still getting everything that I discussed before. They still do exactly the same job. What you do get with adding a sub is you get just that little bit of low-end extension. Now, you don't have to have it really, really loud, just a little bit just to tickle in there if you like. But that little bit of low-end extension means that when you flip to other speakers, if that's the process that you're doing, some people like to actually just mix on NS10s and nothing else, or NS10s with a sub and nothing else. That's totally fine. But if you do this, if you switch to other speakers, it's not going to be as glaringly obvious an issue that, oh my God, I forgot about the bass. I can't hear any bass, so I've been mixing loads of bass into it, and now I can hear the bass. It is blowing my tits off. So yes, I like a sub. It just helps to bridge that gap between other speakers, and it just helps to translate things a little bit better. If you are enjoying this video, please do me a favor and hit the old like and subscribe. It really does help the channel, so thank you very much. Also, if you want some free stuff, sign up to the mailing list below in the description, and I'll send you an EQ cheat sheet, and I'll send you some one-shots that you can use in your mixes. All for free, all totally for free, and I'll only email you every now and again just to let you know more videos are out and some other little things when it happens. So there you go. So there we go. That's basically it. I hope that wasn't too rambling and long. I tried to keep it as concise as possible. And like I said before, lots of people know lots more about all of the amps and the history of it. So go and look that up. There's much more that you can find out about these. This is just a little bit of an overview. But the main thing to take away from this is how fantastic a mixing tool these speakers can be. Like I said before, they focus on the mid-range. Everything is in the mid-range. If you nail the mid-range, then you nail your mix. Now, I'm going to open it up to anyone who wants to have a chat about these. Let me know if anyone else is mixing on NS10s, anyone is really enjoying them, or anyone who really absolutely hates them. I can totally understand that too. Let's have a chat below and see where we go. Okay, thank you very much for listening and for watching. It's been a pleasure. I will see you next time. Bye for now.